Okay, let's go. Number 1. The Spear of Goliath. The year is roughly 1000 BCE. You're standing in the valley of Elah in what is now Israel. The ground is dry, scattered with smooth stones from an ancient riverbed. Two armies face each other across the valley. The Philistines on one ridge, the Israelites on the other. Neither side wants to move first. Then a figure steps forward from the Philistine line, and he keeps stepping forward and forward because he isn't stopping at a normal height. According to the book of Samuel, he stands somewhere between 6 and 9 feet tall, depending on which ancient manuscript you read. The Dead Sea Scrolls version gives a shorter height than the later Masoretic text, a detail scholars still argue about today. But it's not his height that unsettles the soldiers watching him, it's what he's carrying. His spear, the text says, has a shaft like a weaver's beam and an iron head weighing roughly 600 shekels. Convert that into modern measurements, and you get a spearhead weighing approximately 15 pounds. On its own, not counting the shaft. For comparison, a standard Bronze Age spearhead weighed under 2 pounds. Here's where it gets strange. Archaeologists excavating Philistine sites at Gath, believed to be Goliath's hometown, have found something unexpected. Not giant bones, but unusually large iron-working facilities and pottery inscribed with names linguistically similar to Goliath, confirming the name itself was authentically Philistine, not invented later. So the name is real. The city is real. The culture that produced him is real. But the spear itself has never been found. Was it melted down? Buried? Taken as a trophy and lost to history? The Bible tells us what happened to Goliath. It never tells us what happened to his weapon. But this wasn't the last oversized spear said to belong to a giant. And it wasn't the last time a giant turned out to have an uncomfortable amount of real evidence behind him. Number 2. The Club of Finn McCool. The year is 1693. You're a naturalist standing on the northern coast of Ireland, looking at something that defies explanation. 40,000 interlocking basalt columns rising out of the sea, fitting together with a precision that looks deliberate. Some are hexagonal, some are perfectly level, like stepping stones built for something enormous. Locals have a name for it, the Giant's Causeway, and they have a story to explain it. According to Irish legend, a giant named Finn McCool built the causeway by hand, using it as a bridge to Scotland to fight a rival giant. He carried a club, some versions call it a hammer, so heavy that a single blow could shape solid rock. Here's where it gets strange. Geologists in the 18th century arrived expecting to debunk the myth instantly. Instead, they found something unsettling. The causeway is real. It is made of nearly 40,000 basalt columns. It does connect, geologically, to a matching rock formation called Fingal's Cave on the Scottish island of Staffa. Two ends of the same ancient lava flow, split by the sea between them. The scientific explanation is that rapidly cooling lava, roughly 50 to 60 million years old, cracked into these hexagonal columns as it contracted. But that wasn't the detail that made 18th century scientists uneasy. The geometry is too consistent. The columns fit together with almost no gaps, a level of precision normally associated with man-made construction, not natural cooling. Even now, geologists studying the causeway note that duplicating this exact formation artificially is far harder than it looks. The legend says a giant carried a hammer capable of shaping stone at this scale. Science says lava did it, but no one can explain why the same formation, the same rock, the same geometry, appears on both sides of a sea that giants, according to the myth, were said to have crossed by foot. And this wasn't the only formation locals attributed to a giant's tools. Because across the Irish Sea, in Cornwall, a completely different set of giant-carried stone tools was about to be uncovered. Number 3. The Bronze Spear of Talos. The year is roughly 1500 BCE. You're on the island of Crete, watching smoke rise from a coastal village that was, moments ago, untouched. According to Greek myth, this is the work of Talos, a giant made entirely of bronze, forged by Hephaestus, god of the forge, and gifted to King Minos to guard the island. Talos' job was simple: circle the island 3 times a day. Anyone who tried to invade Crete by sea would be met by a giant hurling boulders at their ships, and if that failed, Talos would grab them, hold them against his burning bronze body, and crush them. But Talos also carried something else. In some versions of the myth, a massive bronze spear, or sword, that he used to seal his own body shut after removing it. Because Talos had only one vein, running from his neck to his ankle, sealed by a single bronze nail. Here's where it gets strange. In 1900, archaeologist Arthur Evans began excavating the Palace of Knossos on Crete, the same island the myth describes. What he found wasn't a giant. It was a civilization far more advanced than anyone expected for the Bronze Age. Sophisticated plumbing, massive storage complexes, and bronze working on a scale unmatched anywhere else in the Mediterranean at the time. Historians now believe the myth of Talos may represent something real, just distorted by time, a genuine early warning system, or a fortified coastal defense network, remembered generations later as a single bronze giant. But here's the detail that historians can't fully explain. The myth is oddly specific about how Talos could be killed. Remove the nail at his ankle. Drain the single vein. He collapses. Why would a myth about an invincible bronze protector include such a precise mechanical vulnerability, almost like an engineering flaw deliberately built in? Some historians think this points to Talos being inspired by real bronze statues, automatons, that existed in the ancient world and were known to fail in specific mechanical ways. If that's true, someone in the ancient Mediterranean may have understood basic robotics 3,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. But the blueprints, if they ever existed, are gone. And Talos wasn't the only mechanical giant remembered in ancient myth holding a weapon that operated like a machine. Number 4. The hammer stolen by the Jotnar. The year is somewhere in the Viking Age, though the story itself is older. You're in the Norse world, listening to a skald, a professional storyteller, recite one of the most popular tales in the region. Thor, god of thunder, wakes up to find his hammer, Mjolnir, is missing. Mjolnir isn't just a weapon. According to the Prose Edda, it's a tool capable of leveling mountains, and it always returns to Thor's hand after being thrown, centuries before that exact concept reappeared in modern superhero fiction. The thief is Thrym, king of the Jotnar, the giants of Norse mythology. And Thrym doesn't want money. He wants Freya, goddess of love, as his bride in exchange for the hammer. Here's where it gets strange. The Jotnar in Norse mythology aren't simple monsters. They're older than the gods. Some scholars argue the entire Norse pantheon, the Aesir, is built on a foundation of conflict with a race that came before them, one associated with primal forces, mountains, ice, and the raw shape of the earth itself. In other words, giants, in Norse legend, aren't villains. They're the original inhabitants. And Thrym's demand for the hammer isn't random. Mjolnir, according to the myths, was forged specifically to protect the gods from the giants. Stealing it wasn't an act of theft. It was reclaiming the one object designed to keep his own people at bay. But that wasn't the disturbing part. Historians studying Norse cosmology point out something unsettling. The myths consistently frame the giants as connected to the literal geography of Scandinavia, its mountains, fjords, and glaciers. Some place names across Norway and Iceland are still linked to giant legends today, treated by early settlers not as fiction, but as historical memory of the land's original, unexplained inhabitants. Thor eventually gets the hammer back, disguised as Freya's bride, in a myth the Vikings apparently found hilarious. But the question the story never answers is why a hammer capable of leveling mountains needed to be built at all, unless something on the scale of a mountain was expected to attack. And in nearly every culture on this list, that something keeps having the same description. Number 5. The Iron Bed of Og, King of Bashan. The year is roughly 1200 BCE. You're reading one of the strangest footnotes in the entire Hebrew Bible, a single verse, almost thrown away, in the book of Deuteronomy. It describes a king named Og, ruler of Bashan, defeated in battle. And then, almost as an aside, it mentions his bed. The bed, the text says, is made of iron. It measures roughly 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. And at the time the verse was written, it was reportedly still on display in the city of Rabbah, meaning the writer expected readers to go check for themselves. Here's where it gets strange. Ancient Near Eastern ironworking in 1200 BCE was in its infancy. Iron objects of any size were rare, expensive, and usually reserved for ceremonial or royal use. A 13-foot iron bed frame would have required resources most kingdoms simply didn't have. So why would the text include something so specific? and so easily disprovable, if false, by anyone traveling to Rabbah. Some historians argue bed is a mistranslation, and the object described is actually a basalt sarcophagus. Several have been found in the region, made of dark stone that could be described as iron-colored in ancient Hebrew. Basalt sarcophagi of comparable size have genuinely been excavated in the Bashan region, associated with Amorite royalty, a population later biblical texts describe as unusually tall. But that explanation only shifts the mystery. It doesn't remove it. Because if the bed was really a coffin sized for someone roughly 13 feet long, that raises the same question as Goliath's spear. Who was being buried in something built for a body that size? And why does the Bible mention Og's resting place with the same casual confidence as a modern historian citing a museum exhibit, as though the writer expected it to still be there, waiting to be checked? It's a single verse, almost forgotten, but it's one of the most literal, falsifiable claims about a giant's possessions in the entire ancient world. And this wasn't the last time a burial, not a battlefield, held the evidence. Number 6. The Stone Club of the Cyclops. The year is roughly 700 BCE, the estimated time Homer's Odyssey was composed, though the story is likely centuries older. You're trapped in a cave on the coast of Sicily, according to the myth, along with Odysseus and his crew. Blocking the only exit is a boulder so large that, in Homer's own words, 22 wagons couldn't move it. And guarding that boulder is Polyphemus, a Cyclops, a one-eyed giant, son of the sea god Poseidon. Polyphemus doesn't carry a sword. His weapon is simpler and, in some ways, more terrifying. A massive wooden club, sized for a being who treats boulders like doorstops. Here's where it gets strange. Ancient Greek historian Pausanias, writing centuries after Homer, recorded something unusual. Sicilian locals in his time pointed to real geological formations, enormous circular caves along the coastline, and identified them as the literal homes of the Cyclops. Modern archaeologists studying these coastal caves have found genuine prehistoric human occupation, dating back thousands of years. Some contain unusually large skeletal remains from now extinct dwarf elephants, a detail one modern theory finds significant because a dwarf elephant skull has a large central nasal cavity that, from a distance, resembles a single giant eye socket. In other words, the Cyclops myth may have originated from ancient people discovering elephant skulls and misinterpreting the nasal opening as evidence of a one-eyed giant. But that theory doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why the myth specifies a club, a weapon rooted in raw, brute force rather than intelligence, nor why nearly identical one-eyed giant myths appear independently in cultures with no contact with Greece, from the Middle East to South Asia. Elephant skulls don't travel between continents on their own. So either the misidentification happened many times, in many places, by complete coincidence, or something else explains why so many ancient cultures pictured the same creature holding the same kind of weapon. Number 7. The Mace of Bhima. The year is roughly 400 BCE, the estimated period the Mahabharata was being compiled into the form we know today, though the events it describes are set thousands of years earlier, in a period Hindu tradition treats as historical. You're on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, watching one of the most feared warriors in Indian epic literature, Bhima, one of the 5 Pandava brothers, a man the text repeatedly describes with the strength of thousands of elephants. His weapon is a mace, called a gada, but not a normal one. The text describes it as forged specifically for his impossible strength, so heavy that an ordinary warrior couldn't lift it off the ground, let alone swing it in combat. Here's where it gets strange. The Mahabharata isn't presented as pure myth by the culture that produced it. It's treated, even today, as a historical account layered with divine elements, similar to how some ancient societies blended real kings with legendary ability. Indian archaeologists have spent decades trying to correlate locations mentioned in the epic, including Kurukshetra itself, with real excavation sites, and a city matching the epic's description of Dwarka, submerged off the coast of Gujarat, has genuinely been surveyed by underwater archaeological teams from India's National Institute of Oceanography. That doesn't prove Bhima existed, but it does mean the world the story is set in has real geographic and archaeological anchors, not the setting of a fairy tale, but a specific place scholars can point to on a map. But that wasn't the strangest part. Descriptions throughout the Mahabharata mention advanced weapons. the Brahmastra among them, described in terms some later readers interpreted controversially as resembling weapons of mass destruction. Mainstream historians reject the idea these were literal advanced weapons, treating them instead as poetic and symbolic language. But the mace of Bhima sits in a strange middle ground. Not divine, not magical. Just too heavy, too large, built for a man the epic insists was simply bigger and stronger than anyone else on the battlefield. The epic never explains why Bhima was built that way, only that he was. And half a world away, in South America, a very different set of European explorers were about to describe giants of their own, with a weapon nobody expected. Number 8. The Club of the Patagonian Giants. The year is 1520. You're aboard a ship with Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, anchored off the coast of what is now southern Argentina. According to the ship's official chronicler, Antonio Pigafetta, the crew encounters a man on the shore so tall that the tallest member of Magellan's crew only reaches his waist. Pigafetta's account, a real, surviving historical document, not folklore, describes the man as calm, curious, and unarmed at first. But the account also describes similar figures, in similar encounters recorded by later expeditions to the same region, carrying large bows and heavy wooden clubs, sized to match their reported height. Here's where it gets strange. This isn't a single myth from a single culture. Multiple European expeditions across 2 centuries, Spanish, English, and Dutch, independently reported encountering unusually tall indigenous people in Patagonia, giving this region of South America its name. Patagonia is believed to derive from Patagon, a term possibly linked to these giant-footed figures Magellan's crew described. Modern anthropologists have a more grounded explanation. The Tehuelche people, native to Patagonia, were documented in the 19th century by more rigorous scientific expeditions as genuinely tall by European standards of the time, commonly measured between 5 feet 11 inches and 6 feet 4 inches, a real and significant height difference from 16th century European sailors who averaged closer to 5 feet 5 inches. That difference, amplified by fear, distance, and the unfamiliar, may be enough to explain giants who were simply taller than the explorers expected. But that explanation doesn't fully account for Pigafetta's specific detail about their weapons, bows and clubs described as proportionally oversized, not just the men themselves. Weapon size should scale to what's practical to use, not simply to a person's height. Unless the accounts were exaggerated for a European audience hungry for stories of monsters in the New World. Or unless the earliest encounters really were with people even taller than the Tehuelche later measured by scientists, a population that, by the time of serious 19th century anthropological study, may have already changed. We'll never know for certain. The clubs described by Pigafetta were never collected. No physical evidence survived. Only the written account remains, and the name of an entire region, still called Patagonia, 500 years later. Number 9. The Obsidian-Edged War Club of the Nephilim. The year is unknown, though the text describing them dates to roughly the same era as Goliath, the Book of Genesis, chapter 6. You're reading 4 verses that have caused more theological argument than almost any other passage in the Hebrew Bible. There were giants in the earth in those days, the text says, the Nephilim, described as the offspring of sons of God and human women, and remembered as mighty men, men of renown. The Bible doesn't describe their weapons directly, but later extra-biblical texts, including the Book of Enoch, a text considered scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but excluded from most other biblical canons, go much further, describing the Nephilim teaching humanity how to forge weapons of war for the first time, including blades and instruments of metal previously unknown. Here's where it gets strange. The Book of Enoch was known to exist for centuries, but complete versions were considered lost to Western scholars until 1773, when Scottish explorer James Bruce recovered 3 copies from Ethiopia, where the text had been preserved continuously, treated as legitimate scripture the entire time the rest of the world had forgotten it existed. According to Enoch, it wasn't humanity that developed metal weapons on its own. It was fallen, giant-sized beings who introduced the technology, a detail some scholars argue reflects a real cultural memory of the transition from Stone Age tools to Bronze Age weapons, mythologized as being taught by something inhuman. But that wasn't the unsettling part. Multiple ancient Near Eastern cultures, not just the authors of Genesis, independently describe giant beings introducing weapons and warfare to early humanity, including Mesopotamian Apkallu figures and their connection to early Sumerian records. If these accounts are cultural memory rather than coincidence, the implication is unsettling. Humanity's first weapons weren't invented by us. According to more than one ancient civilization, they were given to us by something the texts never fully explain. And no physical Nephilim weapon has ever been recovered. If the story is memory, the evidence didn't survive with it. Number 10. The Stone Hammer of Lovelock Cave. The year is 1911. You're back in Lovelock Cave, Nevada, decades after the original 1858 discovery, as a proper archaeological excavation begins under the direction of the Nevada Historical Society. This time, it's not miners digging for guano. It's trained researchers carefully cataloging everything they find. And what they find matches the Paiute legend almost exactly. The oral tradition, passed down for generations, described a red-haired people of unusual size who fought a final, brutal war with the ancestors of the Paiute before being trapped in the cave and killed. Here's where it gets strange. The 1911 excavation, led by John Loring, recovered thousands of artifacts, baskets, tools, and skeletal remains, some genuinely showing red or auburn hair, preserved by the cave's extremely dry conditions. Some recovered skulls and bones were measured by researchers at the time as unusually large, sparking widespread claims about a giant race. Modern anthropological review is more cautious. Many of the most extreme height claims traced back to early 20th century newspaper reporting rather than the original scientific measurements, and no peer-reviewed modern analysis has confirmed a distinct giant population at the site. But here's the detail that never made it into the newspaper headlines. Among the genuine artifacts recovered from the cave were oversized stone tools, including a large stone war club, sized noticeably beyond the standard tools used by documented regional tribes, cataloged and stored, for a time, at the Nevada State Museum. The Paiute legend doesn't just describe giants. It describes their weapons specifically, heavy clubs and stones, used in the final battle before the cave was set ablaze to end the siege. And this is where everything changes. Because most of the original skeletal material recovered from Lovelock Cave in 1911, the bones that could have settled the debate scientifically once and for all was lost. Some were reportedly destroyed in a fire. Others were dispersed among private collectors and museums, with incomplete records of where they ended up. The oversized stone club remains one of the only physical objects from the excavation whose existence isn't disputed. The bones that could prove or disprove the legend are gone. The weapon that inspired it is still, in some form, on record. 10 weapons, 10 civilizations, 10 legends of beings larger than us, armed with tools we couldn't lift. A spear too heavy for a normal man in Israel. A hammer capable of shaping stone in Ireland. A mace forged for a single warrior in India. A club carved for a giant's hand on a beach in Patagonia. None of these stories come from the same people. None of these cultures spoke to each other, traded with each other, or shared a written language. And yet, the same idea keeps surfacing. Somewhere in our past, something larger than us existed, and it carried something we couldn't. Maybe it's coincidence. Human minds, faced with the unexplainable, tend to reach for the same simple answer. Make it bigger, make it stronger, make it a giant. Or maybe every culture on Earth is remembering the same thing, filtered through thousands of years and 1,000 different languages, each one preserving a fragment of something none of them fully understood. The bones from Lovelock Cave are gone. The spear of Goliath was never found. The bed of Og is buried somewhere beneath modern Jordan, if it exists at all. Someone, somewhere, decided these things should be forgotten. Or maybe no one decided anything. Maybe time simply erased what we weren't meant to keep. Either way, the doors remain closed. The bones remain missing. The weapons remain, mostly, stories. And the question that started this list is the same question it ends on. What if the giants were real? And what if the only thing we have left of them is the shape of the weapons they left behind? We may never know for certain, but someone, a long time ago, believed it enough to write it down. And that belief is still here, still being told, still being watched right now by you.